We all know that the best way to get information and to get knowledge in our industry is through J.D. Power, right? That's where you go, yes. Okay. So to deliver the US Automotive Outlook from J.D. Power is Charity Taylor. What a beautiful name, Charity, right? Isn't that great? And Julie Knakal.
Hi, everyone. Julie and I have spent a few days among you, or at least a couple anyway, and we've heard several of you speak to the importance of separating fact from emotion. We echo that. So a few years ago, I heard a very compelling quote that's really stuck with me. It says, if we're arguing facts, all facts are equal. But if we're debating opinion, mine counts more. Okay, so I can't tell you who said that quote, but I don't think we can debate the veracity of that statement. In fact, if you're not operating from a base of real power, then opinion is usually a losing battle. So Julie and I have the good fortune of spending a lot of time working with vast amounts of emotionless, dispassionate data. With our teams, we transform that data into fact, turn those facts into insights, and then we engage our clients across the automotive spectrum in productive and constructive dialogue.
So today we're here to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in the industry for 2018. Specifically, let's look at the outlook so far here in 2018. Do you have the clicker?
That's my job. That's your job.
So to start, what better place than sales volumes? It tends to be the place we all go first. So frankly, the news could be better. Total sales for the second year in a row are projected to decline. They remain at very high levels at 17 million units. But here we're talking about total sales. And total sales includes daily rental units, fleet, commercial, and even in some cases, those phantom units. You know what I'm talking about. These are channels that the OEMs can use to vent excess production. And by doing that, they're somewhat obscuring the picture of retail demand, of actual consumer demand. So let's peel back the curtain a little bit and look at retail sales. And here we see that sales actually peaked in 2015, not 2016. And we're expecting industry retail sales to decline for a third straight year. They're actually approaching 2014 levels. Now that sounds like bad news, but whether it's actually bad news is kind of a matter of perspective. You know, of course we'd all prefer to see the industry growing, but the contraction thus far is modest and sales remain at a very high level in absolute.
And we wouldn't talk about sales without talking about price. And prices have only been going up, contrary to sales. In 2018, we're on track to hit $32,600 in average transaction price. That's $1,500 more year over year, and nearly $4,000 delta back to 2014. That's a lot. But it's possible to game the system, maximizing price at the expense of volume, pulling on the other end of the spectrum, and doing the reverse. What really matters is whether those trade-offs pay off. And we see that when we do the multiplication of transaction price against retail volumes and take a look at total retail spending by consumers in the automotive marketplace. And here, the picture is not so dire. In fact, the 2018 outlook calls for rough parity with 2017 levels, which were peak. And that $44 billion number, that's no joke. That's bigger than the gross domestic product of Norway, for heaven's sakes.
So that's the top line. Let's take a look at some of the things that are happening below the surface. And we'll start with an old topic, but it continues to present major headaches for the industry, and that's the shift of cars to trucks and SUVs. We all know how hard it is to sell new cars these days. In fact, in 2018 so far, cars have made up just 32% of industry retail sales volume. That's a very steep decline from what we saw just 4 and 5 years ago. In fact, this decline is accelerating, presenting even new challenges to OEMs because it's so hard to keep up with the change. Don't get me wrong, cars are still a very important part of the market. 32% equals about 4.5 million units per year. But there's still 123 car models for sale compared to just 95 SUVs. And we all know how hard it was for OEMs to make adjustments of 1 or 2 percentage points over the time period spanning 2014 to 2016. Today, with sequential 4 and 5 percentage point drops, the challenge continues to get even greater and greater. In reality, the only way to weather this situation is for some serious and very difficult step function decisions to be made, in which we address and consider future sedan investment and production in advance of the change. And those decisions need to be made quickly. With sales declining and a somewhat collapsing car market, it's no surprise that success is hard to come by. Despite the importance of pricing, this industry still considers sales as the best measure for success. Successful brands are those that are growing sales volume. But whether we look at individual brands or cut all the way down to model lines, it's hard to find success today. So far in 2018, 60% of brands are selling fewer cars and SUVs versus last year. And unsurprisingly, 73% of car lines are down. But maybe more concerning, maybe more surprising, 52% of SUV lines are down, which speaks to the competitiveness of that segment.
And that's a really important point because it brings context to what's going on in the incentive landscape. Now, incentives tend to be lower at the start of the year, escalate throughout the balance, and since the recession, they've only gone one direction on a year-over-year basis, that's up. In fact, in December 2017, we clocked the highest ever recorded level of average incentive spending at $4,400 per unit. That's a big number. And that speaks to the fact that manufacturers are not only trying to stimulate demand in this weakening market, but also dealing with bloated inventory levels. So if there's any silver lining on this page, it's the fact that the rate of increase is slowing. The year-over-year deltas between 17 and 18 are shrinking. Why? In a word, cars. Manufacturers pretty much found the ceiling on this untenable level of incentive spending. Incentives on the average car at the end of 2017 accounted for 14% of MSRP, and that's the average. Some cars were actually transacting with incentive loads of 20% of MSRP and higher. That's simply untenable, unsustainable. Manufacturers have realized that, and so with that, plus the launch of Toyota and Honda brands into the segment, we've actually seen car incentives decline. But what about the stealth incentive? That's non-retail volume. Why do we call it a stealth incentive? Well, because manufacturers can choose, instead of cutting production, to instead discount it and sell it through the fleet channel. Now, fleet is not a bad thing. It's not a dirty word. But excessive fleet can be, and that's because those gently used units return to used supply where they compete with new retail units. Now, look at that number, 23% of total sales on 2018 year-to-date basis were sold through the non-retail channel. That's the biggest since in the post-recession period. And if we look at this in absolute volumes, we see absolute volumes have grown 9% year over year. It's hard to conceive of how there would be so much natural demand in the non-retail market when retail is declining. So we must instead conclude that manufacturers are doing just what we suggested. They're venting excess production by forcing discounted units into a market that otherwise wouldn't demand them.
So far, it feels like the industry has pulled off a little bit of a gravity-defying feat. Flat revenue, despite weakening demand, achieved through higher net transaction prices. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the things that might be supporting this unlikely and
unsustainable
outcome.
So why are new vehicle sales down? That's actually a pretty easy one to explain, and that's the glut of used supply. To demonstrate, here's a look at off-lease maturities. And you can see that there are an extra 300,000 off-lease units coming back in 2018 than there were just a year ago. And that's going to increase with another 400,000 coming back next year. The gap between those two endpoints, that's 1.8 million units. That's a lot. That's in a month and a half of retail sales. So what's so bad about this? Well, these units tend to return to market 3 years old, in pretty good shape, decent odometer readings, and they arrive on dealer lots where they're often certified. And now they're a valuable and very compelling alternative to a new retail sale. With all of this used volume increasing, consumers are having an easier time now than ever before finding a good substitute for a new retail vehicle.
And this phenomenon can also help us explain why the new car market is degrading so quickly. The supply of used cars reflects relatively strong car sales from 2 to 6 years ago. But those vehicles are coming back to a market today where we've seen a dramatic shift in consumer preferences. As such, we have an excess supply of used cars, which will put downward pressure on used car values. To illustrate this chart is showing the ratio between used cars and new car sales at franchise dealerships. To explain, if you look at the car result there for 2015, for every 100 new cars sold, we saw 99 used car sales. Today, in 2018, year to date, for every 100 new cars sold, we're seeing 127 used cars. And this is only going to accelerate because we still have to work through all of the cars that were sold in 2016 and 2017 and beyond. So what's this mean? The new car market is at risk of being overwhelmed by the used car market. All the more reason for OEMs to accelerate the shift from car production to truck and SUV production.
So it's pretty easy to understand why new volumes are down. We can explain that with a single metric. But if you follow the play, when new volumes tend to decline, manufacturers prop up that demand by accelerating incentives, and we're seeing that happening. But then those incentives have a downward pressure on price, and that's not happening. Prices are not declining when incentives rise. In fact, prices continue to escalate. And that's a bit of a mystery, but that mystery deepens when we take into consideration the fact that rates are rising too. The average loan APR for a new vehicle rose 0.5 point year over year. Now that's half of what we saw in terms of growth in the federal funds rate because manufacturers and their captives can buffet that a little bit. But still, these higher rates should be driving higher monthly payments, and consumers would reasonably react by reducing their buy. That's just not happening. Transaction prices continue to grow.
And in the same vein, used car prices are falling, so trade-in values should be falling, thereby decreasing the buying power of consumers in the new car market. This data that's up here right now shows used car values from the J.D. Power Used Car Guide. And while the decline year over year is soft at $300 per unit, it nevertheless tells us that new car prices should be falling, not rising.
So one would reasonably hypothesize, okay, if those are true, then maybe we're just seeing consumers use extended term loans at a higher rate to mitigate that affordability concern. But that's not happening either. These rates are high, but they're stable. Okay, all right. So what the heck is going on with new retail prices? Why are they rising?
So at least part of the answer is that while retail sales volumes are falling, they are not falling evenly across the price spectrum. In fact, vehicles that are transacting at $20,000 and above are actually flat to growing in sales volume. What's happening is the bottom is falling out. Sales of vehicles that transact at $20,000 or fewer are down 20% in 2018.
And if you're following this play, then it's of no shock to you that those with less affluence, less access to credit, are falling out of the market at a faster rate than the rest. In fact, this is a little bit reminiscent of what we saw during the economic downturn. The magnitude differs substantially, but even then, we saw that as the bottom falls out of the market and as new consumers increasingly find the used market, the older, typically, more creditworthy, more affluent consumers continued to buy. That's what's happening here. Now, we just threw a lot at you, so let's wrap it up. Overall, the sky is not falling. What we're seeing is a relatively strong industry where weakening volumes are offset by higher transaction prices, keeping revenues at or near an all-time record.
The sales decline was inevitable. We're coming off the lowest level of used supply coming out of the recession, historically low levels of used supply. So that conversion was destined.
Yeah, it was just going to happen the way we set up all of that leasing in the growth of the industry that followed the downturn. Now, because manufacturers are shooting for their share of an increasingly smaller pie, success is and will continue to be hard to come by. But shooting for that success by overproduction is really problematic. Discipline is key here.
Yeah. And some of the underlying fundamental concerns in the industry remain. Incentives are rising, reliance on non-retail as a channel is increasing, and car production is still too high.
And some of those trends we showed you are going to get worse before they get better. Interest rates, off-lease and off-rent supply will continue to grow. But we've seen worse, and we're a little bit scrappy in this industry, so we can probably make this work. In fact, there is some evidence that manufacturers are, if not embracing this current reality, at least beginning to accept it, as evidenced by Ford's decision to exit the car market and some recently announced production cuts by Nissan.
So to wrap it up, if the OEMs can pay attention, greater attention, to matching production with true natural levels of demand, the industry will weather this cycle and move on to the next one. Thank you very much for your time.